Picture for a moment a scene from the not-so-distant future. A swarm of microscopic machines, smaller than a grain of sand, moves with purposeful precision. They repair damaged tissue, shield surfaces from decay, and weave protective barriers at a molecular level. This is the cutting edge of nanotechnology, a field we think of as belonging to our most advanced laboratories. Now, let your mind travel back in time over 3,000 years to the banks of the Nile. In the dim light of a tomb, a priest chants words of power, his voice echoing off walls covered in intricate symbols. The images he invokes are not of magic wands or simple spells, but of countless unseen divine workers entering the body of the pharaoh, tasked with reassembling his form, making his flesh incorruptible, and ensuring his journey into eternity. What if these two images are not worlds apart, but different descriptions of the very same phenomenon? This is the extraordinary possibility we are exploring today. For centuries, we have interpreted the complex funerary texts of ancient Egypt, the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, and the Book of the Dead, as purely religious and magical documents. They speak of spells, of gods, and of a spiritual transformation. But what if we've been missing a crucial layer of meaning? What if, embedded within the poetic and symbolic language, lies a sophisticated technological blueprint? A growing body of researchers and free thinkers are now proposing a radical idea: that the ancient Egyptians possessed a knowledge so advanced it allowed them to conceptualize and perhaps even implement a form of nanotechnology for the ultimate purpose of preservation, mummification. The question we must ask is not simply did they have nanobots, but a far more profound one. How does a civilization describe a technology it understands perfectly, but for which it has no modern vocabulary? They would not have words like nanometer or synthetic polymer. Instead, they would use the language they had, the language of divinity, of cosmic forces, and of minute, intelligent beings acting with a unified purpose. So, join me on a journey of reinterpretation, where we will look past the familiar translations of scarab beetles and protective spirits and see if we can discern the outlines of something astonishing. We will examine specific passages that describe legions of tiny entities working from within, stabilizing matter and creating an imperishable vessel. This is not about diminishing the spiritual grandeur of ancient Egypt, but about expanding our understanding of their genius. It's a mystery that challenges the very timeline of human innovation, and it begins with a willingness to see the sacred texts in an entirely new light. To truly grasp this concept, we first need a clear picture of what nanobots actually are in our 21st century understanding. In the simplest terms, they are microscopic robots engineered to operate on a scale measured in nanometers. That's 1/1000th of a meter. At this unimaginably small size, these machines are designed to interact directly with atoms and molecules. Their potential tasks are revolutionary. They could deliver drugs to precise locations within a cell, repair damaged DNA, assemble new materials atom by atom, or even, quite relevantly, preserve organic tissue by halting decay at its most fundamental level. The core principle is one of targeted microscopic intervention. Now, holding that idea in mind, let's turn to the ancient world. The Egyptians did not have a word for robot or machine as we know it. Their conceptual framework for explaining complex, invisible processes was built upon a foundation of divinity and cosmic order, known as Maat. So, when they sought to describe a transformative process happening within a body that was invisible to the naked eye, they naturally turned to the language of gods and spirits. This is where we build our conceptual bridge. We are not suggesting that archaeologists will one day uncover a silicon microchip beneath a pyramid. The proposition is far more nuanced. It is that the functional principles the ancient texts describe the idea of countless intelligent agents working in concert to reassemble and fortify a physical form. bear a striking and perhaps uncanny resemblance to the core objectives of nanotechnology. When a spell from the coffin text speaks of the multitude of those who are in the following of Osiris, entering the deceased and making his bones into iron and his limbs into imperishable stars, we are being given a poetic description. But if we peel back the layer of poetry, what is the underlying action? It is an infusion of an external agency that fundamentally alters the material properties of the body, making it durable and timeless. This is precisely the goal of using nanobots for preservation. Therefore, for this exploration, we will interpret these descriptions of divine, invisible workers not as a claim about literal, manufactured robots, but as a sophisticated metaphorical model for a technological process. It is the difference between describing a heart attack as a feeling of an elephant sitting on your chest and a doctor describing it as myocardial infarction caused by a blockage in a coronary artery. Both are describing the same reality using the vocabulary available to them. The ancient Egyptian priests were the scientists and doctors of their time. They observed cause and effect in the natural world with incredible precision. If they had developed a method, perhaps through advanced chemistry or a lost biological science, to initiate a self-perpetuating process of preservation at a microscopic level, how else would they record that achievement except through the rich, symbolic language of their culture? They would speak of the divine craftsmen and the followers of Osiris because those terms conveyed the concepts of purposeful, intelligent, and small-scale action. This perspective allows us to see the texts not as mere superstition, but as potential documentation of a forgotten scientific paradigm, one that we are only now beginning to rediscover. Our journey into this intriguing possibility begins with the texts themselves, the very documents that have preserved the ancient Egyptian vision of the afterlife for millennia. To understand how they might describe a process akin to nanotechnology, we must first become familiar with the primary sources. The oldest of these are the pyramid texts, inscribed on the walls of the pyramids at Saqqara during the Old Kingdom over 4,000 years ago. These are the world's oldest known religious texts, a collection of spells and utterances intended to protect and deify the pharaoh, ensuring his resurrection and ascension to join the gods. They are filled with potent, often cryptic language, speaking of the king's bones being reassembled and his body being transformed into a luminous, eternal substance. Following the pyramid texts, we have the coffin texts from the First Intermediate Period and the Middle Kingdom. As the name suggests, these spells were written not on tomb walls, but directly onto the coffins of elite non-royal individuals, democratizing the afterlife journey that was once reserved for pharaohs. The coffin texts expand significantly on the themes of transformation and protection, introducing a richer cosmology and more detailed descriptions of the challenges the soul would face. It is here that we find even more vivid imagery of the deceased being fortified from within, with spells that call upon legions of divine beings to enter the body and make it strong and enduring like iron or flint. The most famous of these collections, however, is the Book of the Dead, or as the Egyptians called it, the Book of Coming Forth by Day. This New Kingdom compilation is a sprawling guidebook for the soul's journey through the underworld, often written on papyrus scrolls and placed in the tomb with the deceased. It contains nearly 200 spells accompanied by beautiful illustrations, detailing everything from protecting the heart to navigating past monstrous guardians. Crucially, it is absolutely essential to remember that these texts were never intended to be read as scientific or technical manuals. They are fundamentally magical and religious documents, their primary purpose to guide the spirit through a supernatural landscape using the power of spoken word, ritual, and symbolism. And it is precisely this symbolic nature that opens the door to our reinterpretation. Because when a culture lacks a specific technical vocabulary, it uses the language it has to describe observed phenomena. If the priests who developed the mummification process witnessed, or perhaps even engineered a chemical or biological reaction that created a stable, preserved state at a microscopic level, how would they record that achievement? They would not write a biochemical formula. Instead, they would encode the process within their existing framework of divine intervention. The multitude of divine workers described in these spells could be a metaphorical way of explaining the actions of countless microscopic agents. The transformation of flesh into imperishable stone or shining stars might be a poetic description of a material change that renders the body resistant to decay. By viewing these texts not just as literal magic but as potential allegories for a highly advanced preservation technology, we can start to look for patterns and descriptions that align remarkably well with the principles of nanotechnology. The key is to listen to what the texts are saying about the process itself, rather than getting caught solely on the names of the gods and spirits involved. To understand how the ancient Egyptians could have conceptualized a process as intricate as microscopic preservation, we must first dive into their understanding of the very fabric of reality, a concept they called Heka. Often translated simply as magic, this translation fails to capture the profound and technical nature of what Heka truly represented. It was not about illusion or superstition. It was understood as the fundamental, generative force of the universe itself, the raw power of creation that the gods used to bring the world into being. More importantly for our exploration, the Egyptians believed Heka was a tangible force that could be accessed, directed, and commanded by those who knew the correct words, rituals, and true names of things. It was the operative principle that made prayers effective, rituals potent, and spells reality-altering. In this sense, Heka functioned less like the vague magic of fairy tales and more like a universal operating system, a set of fundamental laws that, when invoked correctly, could produce predictable and specific outcomes in the physical world. This idea of Heka as a programmable force is the critical bridge to our nanotechnology hypothesis. Think of it this way: in a modern lab, a scientist programming a swarm of nanobots doesn't use a wand, they use code. They write precise instructions in a language the machines understand, directing them to perform specific tasks like bind to this type of cell or release this compound. The code itself is an immaterial set of rules, but it exerts a direct and powerful influence over material reality. Now consider the Egyptian priest. He didn't have Python or C++. His programming language was the spoken word, the true name of a deity, the specific sequence of a ritual, and the powerful imagery of a spell. He believed that by correctly deploying this symbolic language, he was tapping directly into Heka, the universe's source code, and issuing a command. The spell was the program, the recitation was its execution. This reinterpretation allows us to see the funerary texts in a stunning new light. The countless utterances and spells weren't just hopeful prayers. They can be viewed as detailed lines of code designed to initiate and manage a complex preservation process. A spell that commands the followers of Osiris to make firm the flesh and knit together the bones is not merely a poetic wish. If we see Heka as the executable force, then this spell becomes a command sequence, an instruction set launched into the universe to guide the invisible, intelligent agents, our potential nanobots, in their work. The specificity found in many spells, detailing which part of the body is to be transformed and into what substance, reinforces this idea of targeted programming. It's the difference between a general command like preserve the body and a specific subroutine like target the cellular structure of the thoracic cavity and induce cross-linking for structural integrity. The profound implication here is that the Egyptians may have possessed a sophisticated understanding of cause and effect that we have historically dismissed as purely religious. They observed that certain words, certain substances, and certain actions, when combined in a precise formula, could produce a repeatable physical result, in this case a mummy that defied decay for millennia. Their explanation for why it worked was Heka, Our explanation might be biochemistry or nanotechnology, but both explanations point toward the same underlying truth, a deep, systematic knowledge of how to manipulate matter. By viewing Heka not as a supernatural exception to the rules of nature, but as their term for the very rules themselves, a technology of consciousness and language, we open up the possibility that the pyramid texts and the Book of the Dead are among the most sophisticated technical manuals ever written, their instructions encoded in a language of metaphor and divinity that we are only beginning to decipher. This notion of spells as executable code leads us directly to one of the most pivotal and visually striking rituals in the entire mummification process, the opening of the mouth ceremony. Performed just before the mummy was sealed within its tomb, this elaborate rite was considered absolutely essential for the deceased's rebirth. We are told that its purpose was to restore the senses to the body, to allow the dead to see, hear, smell, speak, and eat in the afterlife, transforming the inert mummy from a mere preserved corpse into a living, functioning vessel for the spirit. Traditionally, we see this as a powerful symbolic act, a magical gesture that uses ritual tools to achieve a spiritual awakening. But what if we apply our new lens? What if this ceremony was the equivalent of pressing the on switch? The ritual itself was remarkably precise. A priest, often wearing a mask of the jackal god Anubis, would use a series of specialized instruments to touch the mummy's mouth, eyes, ears, and nose. The most important of these tools was the Pesesh Kef, a curious forked blade, along with an adze, a chisel, and other ceremonial items. With each touch, specific incantations were recited, calling upon gods like Ptah, the divine craftsman, and Horus, the son of Osiris, to perform the act of opening. The ceremony didn't stop at the face. It sometimes involved touching the arms and feet, restoring the deceased's ability to move and grasp. From a conventional viewpoint, this is a beautiful metaphor for reanimation. However, from a technological perspective, the specificity is startling. It bears an uncanny resemblance to an initialization sequence for a highly complex system. Think of a modern technician deploying a swarm of medical nanites. These microscopic machines might be inert upon introduction, needing a specific external signal, a particular frequency of light, a magnetic pulse, or a chemical trigger to wake up and begin their programmed task. The technician doesn't just wave a general tool over the patient, they target specific areas. They might use a focused beam to activate nanites in the optical nerve to repair vision, or a different signal to activate those in the cochlea to restore hearing. The parallel is compelling. The priest, using his ritually charged tools, was not merely performing magic. He was conducting a precise activation protocol. The Pesesh Kef touching the lips was not just a symbol for opening the mouth. It was the delivery mechanism for the command that would deploy or activate the microscopic workers responsible for restoring speech and consumption functions in the afterlife realm. This interpretation transforms the entire ceremony from a hopeful prayer into a critical, functional step in a technological process. The spells recited were not just invocations. They were the final lines of code, the run command that set the entire internal preservation and restoration system into its active state. The involvement of Ptah, the patron god of craftsmen and architects, is particularly significant. He was the deity who conceived of the world in his heart and then spoke it into existence, the ultimate programmer. By calling upon Ptah during this ritual, the priests were essentially linking their actions to the fundamental creative power of the universe, the same power needed to reboot a system at the most minute level. The ceremony, therefore, becomes the moment when the meticulously prepared physical vessel, the mummy, potentially infused with preservative agents acting at a microscopic scale, is brought fully online, its sensory and motor interfaces activated and ready for the consciousness of the deceased to inhabit once more. It was the final, crucial step that moved the process from preservation to full reanimation. With the opening of the mouth ceremony acting as the potential activation sequence, we must now look at what was being activated. This brings us to one of the most tangible and frequently mentioned elements in the funerary texts, the application of sacred oils and unguents. Throughout the Book of the Dead, spells repeatedly call for the anointing of the mummy with what are described as divine fluids. These were not ordinary oils, they were substances believed to originate from the gods themselves, possessing transformative powers. Spell 137b, for instance, is a powerful ritual for making a magical brick, and it involves anointing a figure of the guardian deity with special unguents. The language used goes far beyond simple anointment. It speaks of saturation of the substance permeating every part of the recipient, making them firm and strong. From a traditional viewpoint, this is a spiritual act, infusing the body with the essence of divinity. But through our technological lens, the description takes on a fascinating new dimension. What if these divine fluids were, in fact, a sophisticated chemical or biological medium? A carrier solution designed to deliver microscopic agents throughout the body. The texts emphasize the complete permeation of the body by these substances. This is a critical detail. It wasn't a superficial coating. The process aimed for total saturation, suggesting the substance needed to reach deep into the tissues. This aligns perfectly with the objective of a nanoscale preservation technology. For such agents to be effective, they would need to be distributed via a liquid medium that could flow into the smallest capillaries, the interstitial spaces between cells, and penetrate to the deepest layers of tissue. The nature of these unguents is also highly suggestive. Egyptologists have identified some of the ingredients used in mummification bombs, materials like pine resin, beeswax plant oils, and bitumen. While these have preservative qualities on their own, what if their primary function was more complex? In a modern nanotech application, a gel or liquid carrier is essential. It suspends the nanobots, prevents them from clumping together, and facilitates their even distribution. The resins and waxes used by the Egyptians could have served as a perfect stabilizing matrix, a slow-release medium that would keep the active agents, whatever they may have been, protected and functional for centuries. The bitumen, which gave the black color associated with Osiris, the god of resurrection, might have had properties beyond symbolism. Certain carbon-based compounds can have interesting effects at the molecular level. Perhaps the most compelling part of the textual description is the promised outcome. The spells state that these fluids will make the body incorruptible, that the flesh will become like iron and the limbs like the imperishable stars. These are not vague promises of spiritual well-being. They are specific claims about a physical transformation of the body's material properties. This is precisely the goal of advanced preservation. If a swarm of nanoscale agents were deployed, their task could be to create a cross-linked matrix within the cellular structure, reinforcing tissues against enzymatic breakdown and bacterial attack, effectively turning soft, perishable organic matter into a stable, mineral-like composite. The ancient priests, observing that their process resulted in a body that did not decay, would have described this miraculous outcome in the only terms they had: the language of metallic strength and cosmic permanence. The divine fluid, therefore, may not have been magical in the fairy tale sense, but it could have been the delivery mechanism for a technology so advanced that its description became woven into the fabric of their sacred rituals. This idea of being saturated with a transformative substance from the outside leads us to an even more intimate and startling set of descriptions found within the texts: the act of swallowing the gods themselves. We encounter spells where the deceased is instructed to consume divine entities, most famously the Eye of Horus. On the surface, this sounds like a bizarre and violent form of mythological cannibalism. But when we move beyond a literal reading, a far more sophisticated and technologically resonant metaphor emerges. The act of swallowing, of internalizing a powerful external agent, is a profound symbol for ingestion and integration. What if this is the ancient Egyptian way of describing the deployment of specialized, autonomous units designed to work from within the body's core? The Eye of Horus is not just a random body part, it is one of the most potent symbols in all of Egyptian mythology. It represents wholeness, healing, and restoration, as it was the eye torn from Horus in his battle with Seth and later magically restored by the god Thoth. To swallow the Eye of Horus, therefore, is to internalize the very principle of making something whole again. A spell from the coffin texts might command, "I have swallowed the Eye of Horus. It is placed within me so that my body may be whole." From a traditional perspective, this is a magical act, absorbing the power of the god. But from our alternative viewpoint, the language is strikingly specific. It describes the introduction of a restorative agent into the system, with the explicit purpose of repairing and maintaining the integrity of the physical form. This sounds less like a prayer and more like a technical specification for a repair mechanism. Let's push this interpretation further. Imagine these deities not as anthropomorphic beings, but as personifications of specific functions. The Eye of Horus could be a poetic name for a specialized type of nanoscale unit programmed for a single critical task: internal organ preservation. The process of mummification involved the removal of most major organs, which were then placed in canopic jars. But the body itself was not left empty. It was treated with natron and anointed with oils. What if the swallowing ritual was part of a process that introduced a secondary line of defense? These internal deities would be autonomous units, released into the body cavity to patrol and protect the remaining tissues from internal decay, to reinforce cellular structures, or to neutralize any residual moisture or bacteria that the initial drying process might have missed. The concept of these units being autonomous is key and is beautifully reflected in the nature of the gods they represent. A deity like the goddess Serpent, associated with scorpions and protection against venom, could be seen as the personification of an anti-pathogen unit. A spell calling for the deceased to be filled with Serpent might be an instruction to deploy microscopic agents designed to identify and neutralize biological threats at a molecular level. Similarly, the warrior god Montu could represent aggressive, defensive units programmed to create a protective barrier around sensitive areas. The texts often speak of these internalized gods fighting off the forces of chaos and decay from within the body, a perfect allegory for a microscopic, automated defense system. This interpretation transforms the seemingly strange ritual of God swallowing from an act of primitive superstition into a highly logical procedure. The priests weren't literally feeding the mummy pieces of statuary. They were using the most powerful language they possessed to encode a complex technological process. The recitation of the spell during the ritual was the activation command, and the act of swallowing, which could have been symbolized by placing a specific substance in the mummy's mouth or anointing the throat, was the deployment mechanism. The goal was clear: to saturate the internal environment with active, intelligent protectors. The promise that the body would remain whole and uncorrupted, defended from within by the very powers that upheld the universe, becomes a tangible outcome of a successfully implemented preservation technology. It suggests a level of understanding about systemic protection that we are only now, with our own nanotechnology, beginning to achieve. Building directly on the idea of internalized deities functioning as autonomous protectors, we encounter what is perhaps the most visible and potent symbol of active defense in all of Egyptian iconography, the Uraeus. This stylized, erect cobra, forever poised to strike, is instantly recognizable atop the crowns of pharaohs and the brow of the deceased. Conventionally, the Uraeus represents divine authority, royalty, and the protective fury of the goddess Wadjet. It is described in the texts as spitting fire, its venomous breath incinerating the enemies of order. We are meant to understand this as a powerful magical guardian, a symbol of the king's power extending even into death. Yet, when we apply our technological lens, this image of a constantly vigilant, reactive entity takes on a startling new specificity. It begins to sound less like a general protective charm and more like a detailed description of an automated security system. Consider the core functions of the Uraeus as described. It is always awake, always watching. It does not need to be commanded to act in each moment. It operates autonomously, responding to threats in real time. Its primary weapon is not a physical spear or sword, but a projectile fire or venom that it can deploy at a distance against a specific target. This is a remarkably precise set of capabilities. If we were to translate this into modern technical specifications for a security system, we will be talking about sensors, threat recognition software, and a targeted countermeasure delivery mechanism. The Uraeus, in this reinterpretation, becomes a powerful allegory for a network of nanoscale defensive units programmed for perimeter control and internal sanitization. The logical placement of the Uraeus is the first compelling clue. Positioned on the head, it symbolizes a system of awareness and command. But its protective function is not limited to the crown. It is meant to safeguard the entire sacred space of the tomb and the body within. This suggests a system that is centralized in its command and control function, but distributed in its operational range. Imagine microscopic sensors, perhaps integrated into the burial shroud, the tomb walls, or even distributed within the mummy's wrappings themselves. These sensors would be constantly monitoring the microenvironment for specific threats, the presence of foreign bacteria, fungal spores, or the chemical signatures of decay. These are the enemies. The texts speak of the forces of chaos known as Isfet, which seek to return the ordered form of the mummy to disordered decay. When such a threat is detected, the system would not wait for a command from a priest. It would act autonomously, just like the Uraeus. The description of spitting fire is particularly evocative. What might fire represent at a microscopic level? It could be a metaphor for a rapid, localized release of energy or a reactive chemical agent. Certain metallic nanoparticles, for instance, can act as catalysts or can produce reactive oxygen species when stimulated by light or environmental changes. A literal, contained burst of oxidative fire that is lethal to microorganisms but contained enough not to damage the preserved tissues. Alternatively, venom could symbolize a targeted antimicrobial peptide or a nano-engineered enzyme designed to break down the cell walls of invading bacteria. The key point is the action, a targeted, rapid response to a specific, identified threat, neutralizing it before it can cause systemic damage. This concept of an autonomous, active defense is a significant leap beyond a simple preservative. A preservative is passive. It creates a hostile environment for decay. An autonomous defense system is proactive and adaptive. It can respond to new, unforeseen threats that might emerge over centuries. This level of sophistication aligns with the Egyptian desire for eternal preservation. They weren't just trying to preserve the body for a few hundred years, they were building for eternity. A passive method might eventually fail as conditions slowly change, but a system that can monitor and adapt, that can fight a continuous, silent war against entropy itself, that is a technology worthy of describing with the most powerful symbol of royal power they possessed. The Uraeus, therefore, may be far more than a symbol. It could be the ancient Egyptians' way of encoding the principles of a self-sustaining, microscopic immune system for the dead. A final, eternal guardian programmed to ensure that the sacred vessel of the soul remained intact against all foes forever. But perhaps the most compelling evidence for a targeted, systematic approach to preservation lies not within the body itself, but standing guard beside it, the iconic Canopic jars. For centuries, we've understood these four vessels, each topped with a distinct human, baboon, jackal, or falcon head, as simple sacred containers. Their purpose, we were told, was purely practical and ritualistic. During mummification, the lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines were removed, carefully treated, and then placed into their respective jars to be buried alongside the mummy. This was seen as a way to keep the organs safe for the afterlife, with each jar protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus. But what if this interpretation only scratches the surface? What if the Canopic jars represent something far more sophisticated than mere storage? What if they are the key to understanding a system of highly specialized, organ-specific preservation? Let's re-examine the process with our new perspective. The removal of the organs was a critical step. These soft, moist, bacteria-filled tissues were the primary sites of decay. Simply leaving them inside the body would have made long-term preservation nearly impossible. So, the Egyptian embalmers took them out, but they didn't discard them. They treated them, anointed them, and then placed them into these specially designated, ritually charged containers. This act alone suggests a level of importance that goes beyond simple safekeeping. It implies that each organ system required its own unique handling, its own specific preservation protocol. In a modern medical context, this is exactly what we would do. You wouldn't preserve heart tissue with the same chemical cocktail you use for brain tissue. Each has a different cellular structure and requires a tailored approach. This is where the idea of specialized maintenance modules becomes so powerful. Each canopic jar, guarded by its specific deity, can be reinterpreted as representing a dedicated team of nanoscale agents, each team programmed with a unique function for a particular biological subsystem. The jar itself is not just a pot, it is the symbolic housing for that specialized team and its mission parameters. The deity associated with the jar is not merely a guardian spirit, it is the personification of that team's core programming. Let's meet the teams. Imseti, the human-headed god, guarded the liver. In ancient Egyptian thought, the liver was central to life and emotion, often considered the seat of the soul. A team of nanites under the command of Imseti, therefore, might have been programmed for deep structural integrity, focusing on stabilizing the complex, dense tissue of the liver against enzymatic breakdown. Next, Hapi, the baboon-headed god, protected the lungs. The lungs are a delicate, air-filled, capillary-rich organ. Their preservation would require a completely different strategy, one focused on maintaining alveolar structure and preventing collapse. The nanite team of Hapi, then, could be envisioned as specialists in creating internal scaffolding or a reinforcing matrix at the microscopic level, allowing the fragile lung tissue to retain its form for eternity. Then we have Duamutef, the jackal-headed god, who was responsible for the stomach. This is an organ designed for extreme acidity and constant churning, a harsh environment. Its preservation would require agents capable of neutralizing residual acids and fortifying the stomach lining. Duamutef's team might be programmed for chemical neutralization and creating a protective, acid-resistant barrier on the cellular walls. Finally, Kebesenuf, the falcon-headed god, watched over the intestines. As the site of complex bacterial ecosystems and waste processing, the intestines presented the greatest challenge from a decay perspective. The nanites under Kebesenuf's domain would logically be the clean-up crew and the defensive line. Their programming could involve aggressively targeting and breaking down residual organic matter and deploying powerful antimicrobial measures to ensure the long-term sterility of the intestinal tract. This reinterpretation transforms the 4 sons of Horus from passive guardians into active project managers, each overseeing a highly trained specialist unit with a clearly defined mission objective. The jars are not just storage, they are the ceremonial representation of this entire distributed, multi-specialty preservation network. The act of placing the organs into their respective jars was the final step in assigning each organ to its dedicated maintenance team, ensuring that every part of the deceased's physical form received the precise, custom-tailored treatment required for its eternal preservation. This entire system of specialized protectors and internal maintenance modules points toward a grander, more fundamental principle at work, the principle of autonomous transformation. And to understand that, we must turn our attention to one of the most enduring and powerful symbols in all of Egyptian culture, the scarab beetle. Known as Khepri, this humble insect was not merely a popular amulet, it was a god intimately connected to the central event of each day, the rising of the sun. The Egyptians observed the scarab rolling a ball of dung across the ground, and within that ball they saw a miracle. The female beetle would lay her egg inside this ball of waste, and from what was essentially refuse, a new beetle would spontaneously emerge fully formed. To the ancient mind, this was the ultimate allegory for spontaneous creation, for life emerging from death, for the new born from the old. Khepri was the god of the morning sun, the self-created one, who pushed the solar disk across the sky just as the beetle pushed its dung ball, bringing light, warmth, and renewal to the world. Now, let's hold that image in our minds and pivot to a core concept in modern nanotechnology, self-assembly. This is a revolutionary idea where scientists don't build structures piece by piece with tiny tools. Instead, they design molecules or nanoparticles with specific properties so that when they are mixed together under the right conditions, they spontaneously organize themselves into the desired complex structure. It's like throwing a box of Lego bricks into the air and having them land as a fully assembled castle. The components are programmed to find each other and click into place without external guidance. This is the holy grail of nanotechnology because it allows for the creation of incredibly complex systems at a scale where direct manipulation is impossible. The parallel between these two concepts is nothing short of breathtaking. The scarab's dung ball, a seemingly chaotic mass of base material, transforming into a perfectly formed, living beetle, is a near-perfect ancient analogy for the process of molecular self-assembly. The ball is the raw material, the disorganized atoms and molecules. The unseen process happening inside the ball is the programmed interaction, the hidden code that guides the components to assemble into a complex, functioning whole. The emergence of the beetle is the finished product, the new structure that has arisen from the chaos. In the context of mummification, this symbolism becomes profoundly technological. The spells often speak of the deceased being renewed and becoming again, of a new glorified body, the Sahu being assembled for the afterlife. This was not just a vague hope for spiritual resurrection, it was a description of a physical transformation. What if the rituals and unguents we've discussed were designed to initiate a process of self-assembly within the mummy? The base materials could be the treated tissues of the body itself, combined with the introduced chemical agents from the sacred oils. The programming would be the spells, the utterances of Heka which directed the process, and the scarabs, the active agents, would be the countless microscopic workers, the personified nanites, working tirelessly from within to reorganize the molecular structure of the flesh, building it anew into an incorruptible form. The scarab amulets placed over the heart of the mummy take on a stunning new significance in this light. They weren't just general good luck charms for rebirth. They were specific emblems, perhaps even functional components, representing the core programming of the entire operation. The command for the system to self-assemble, to transform the base material of the mortal body into the eternal, spiritual body, just as Khepri renewed the sun each dawn. The beetle pushing the sun becomes the ultimate symbol of a microscopic workforce pushing a process of creation to its glorious conclusion, a testament to the Egyptian understanding of a universe built on principles of cyclical, self-directed transformation. All of this incredible preparation, the anointing with sacred fluids, the swallowing of protective deities, the activation of the Uraeus defense system, and the specialized organ maintenance leads to one final, critical moment before the tomb is sealed for eternity. This brings us to arguably the most famous and dramatic scene from the entire Egyptian afterlife, the weighing of the heart ceremony. As depicted in countless papyri from the Book of the Dead, the deceased stands before Osiris, lord of the underworld. Their heart, the only major organ intentionally left within the mummified body, is placed on one side of a giant scale. On the other side rests the feather of Maat, representing truth, order, and cosmic balance. The jackal-headed god Anubis carefully adjusts the scale, while the ibis-headed Thoth, god of wisdom and writing, stands ready to record the result. If the heart is as light as the feather, the deceased is judged righteous and granted access to the afterlife. But if the heart is heavy with sin, it is devoured by the monstrous Ammit, the devourer of the dead, resulting in a second permanent death. For thousands of years, this has been understood as a purely moral and spiritual judgment. It was the ultimate test of a person's earthly life, a divine audit of their character. But what if we consider this scene not as a final judgment of the soul's morality, but as the ultimate quality assurance test for the preservation technology itself? What if this was the ancient Egyptian way of depicting a critical system integrity check? To see this, we must first understand the profound importance the Egyptians placed on the heart. Unlike other cultures that located consciousness in the brain, the ancient Egyptians believed the heart, or ib, was the center of a person's intellect, memory, emotion, and will. It was the source of a person's true character and the record of all their deeds. This is why it was meticulously left inside the body during mummification, often with a heart scarab amulet placed over it bearing a spell begging it not to testify against its owner. The heart was the ultimate storage device, the hard drive containing the complete data of an individual's identity. The afterlife was not about escaping the body, but about continuing a conscious existence. For that to happen, the vessel had to be sound, and most importantly, the data had to be intact and uncorrupted. Now, let's reimagine the weighing scene with this technological analogy in mind. The entire mummification process, with its potential nanoscale interventions, was an incredibly complex operation. How would the priests know if it had been successful? How could they verify that the body was truly eternally preserved, and just as crucially, that the essential data, the memories and identity held within the heart, had not been degraded or lost? The weighing of the heart ritual provides a stunning metaphorical answer. The scale itself becomes a diagnostic instrument. The feather of Maat represents the ideal state, perfect balance, stability, and integrity. A successfully preserved body, one that has been perfectly stabilized against decay, would be in a state of Maat order. The heart, as the core component, must also be in this state. If the preservation process has worked flawlessly, the heart tissue, and by extension the data it holds, will be perfectly stable. It will be as light as the feather because it is uncorrupted, its molecular structure fixed in an ordered state. It is in balance, but if the preservation has failed, if moisture remained, if bacteria began to work, if the chemical treatments were imbalanced, then the heart would be undergoing decay. Decay is chaos, disorder, and isfet. In this metaphorical system, decay would add weight, a symbolic representation of corruption and instability. A heavy heart signifies a system failure. The data is becoming corrupted, the vessel is breaking down. The roles of the gods in this scene then take on specific technical functions. Anubis, the master of embalming, is the chief technician operating the diagnostic equipment. He is the one who performed the procedure and is now running the final test. Thoth, the divine scribe and god of knowledge, is not merely recording a moral pass or fail, he is generating the system log. He is documenting the integrity of the data, confirming that the file is complete and uncorrupted. His scroll is the final report, and the terrifying Ammit, the hybrid creature waiting to consume the failed heart, is the ultimate symbol of a system wipe. A failed integrity check results in the total and irreversible deletion of the data. The entity that was the deceased is lost forever because the physical medium that housed it has succumbed to the entropy it was designed to defy. This reinterpretation transforms the entire judgment hall from a court of moral law into a sacred laboratory for verification. The 42 assessor gods who sometimes witness the event could be seen as representing the 42 different parameters or metrics of the preservation process that must all be verified as being within acceptable limits. The deceased's declaration of innocence, where they claim not to have committed various sins, can be reinterpreted as a final checklist recited by the priests, affirming that every ritual step was performed correctly and no procedural errors were made. The successful outcome, the heart balancing perfectly, is the ultimate confirmation that the incredibly complex, multi-stage process of technological mummification has achieved its goal. The vessel is sealed, the defensive systems are active, the maintenance modules are in place, and the core data is secure. Only then is the deceased presented to Osiris, the operating system of the afterlife, and granted permission to come forth by day as a functioning, eternal being. But the ultimate test of preservation and system integrity is only the beginning of the afterlife journey. Once the deceased was judged worthy and entered the divine realm, a new challenge emerged, the need to maintain their eternal existence. This was a world of gods and spirits, but it was also a place where work needed to be done. Fields had to be tilled, canals had to be dredged, and offerings had to be presented. To handle these eternal chores, the ancient Egyptians developed one of the most charming and yet technologically suggestive elements of their burial goods, the shabti. These were small mummiform figurines, often numbering in the hundreds, placed in the tomb with a very specific purpose. Inscribed on each one was a spell from chapter 6 of the Book of the Dead, which gave them a simple, direct command. If the deceased is called upon to do any manner of work in the afterlife, the shabti is to answer, "Here I am," and step in to perform that labor instead. On the surface, this is a delightful solution to a practical concern. It's the ancient equivalent of hiring a staff for your eternal retirement. But when we apply our technological lens, the concept of the shabti transforms into something far more profound than a simple substitute laborer. These figurines begin to look like the physical representation of a deployable, programmable workforce, a literal army of automated workers. Think about the specifications. They are numerous, often one for each day of the year, plus overseers, creating a complete workforce of 365 plus 36, totaling 401 figures. They are ready and waiting, stored within the tomb until needed. Most importantly, they are programmable. The spell inscribed on their bodies is their operating instruction. They are not sentient, they respond to a specific trigger, the call to work, and execute a predefined response. This is a precise analogy for how we would deploy a swarm of specialized nanobots for a large-scale task. In a hypothetical future, we might send microscopic machines into a contaminated area to break down pollutants. We wouldn't guide each one individually. Instead, we would program them all with a simple, reactive protocol. When you detect chemical X, initiate cleanup procedure Y. The shabti operates on the same principle. It is an autonomous agent activated by a specific condition, and it performs its duty without further supervision. The fact that they are depicted with tiny hoes and baskets isn't just quaint symbolism, it's a clear statement of their function. They are tools designed for a job. Now, let's extend this metaphor from the figurine on the tomb floor to the potential reality within the mummified body. What if the shabtis are not merely symbolic statues, but are in fact an allegory for a different kind of microscopic workforce? A workforce not of preservation, but of maintenance and resource management within the afterlife itself. The work of the afterlife might not be agricultural in a literal sense. It could represent the ongoing, microscopic work required to sustain the perfected body, the sahu, in its new environment. The divine realm, while perfect, might still be subject to the faint, slow creep of entropy. The fields to be tilled could be a metaphor for the cellular landscape, requiring constant monitoring and fine-tuning. The canals to be dredged might represent the need to ensure the flow of energy or the removal of any microscopic imperfections that could threaten the body's eternal integrity. In this scenario, the legion of Shabtis becomes a standing army of maintenance nanobots, each one programmed for a specific minor repair task. Some might be programmed to patrol the circulatory system, acting as a microscopic maintenance crew for the reinforced vessels. Others could be tasked with constantly scanning the structural matrix of the tissues, reinforcing any molecular bonds that show signs of weakness over the millennia. The overseer Shabtis, often holding whips, would represent the command and control units that coordinate the efforts of the worker teams, ensuring a harmonious and efficient system. This explains why a single individual would need hundreds of these workers. The task of maintaining a complex biological system for eternity is immense, requiring a vast, distributed network of autonomous agents. The spell itself, "Here I am, I will do it," is the key to this entire concept. It is the ultimate expression of automation. The deceased does not need to micromanage their eternal form. The system is self-sustaining. Once activated by the journey through the afterlife, this internal workforce takes over all menial tasks of bodily upkeep. This frees the consciousness of the deceased, the Ba or spirit, to engage in the higher pursuits of the divine realm, communing with the gods, traveling across the sky with Ra, and experiencing eternal bliss. The Shabti, therefore, is the final piece of the technological puzzle. It's the guarantee that the magnificently preserved vessel, which passed its integrity check in the Hall of Judgment, will not slowly degrade over infinite time. It represents a technology so advanced that it includes its own perpetual maintenance system, an eternal promise that the hard work of existence is now fully automated, leaving the soul forever free. Now that we've envisioned the complex internal systems potentially at work, from the defensive Uraeus to the specialized maintenance teams of the Canopic jars, we must turn our attention to the most critical and practical step that made any of this possible: the initial preparation of the canvas itself. Before a single spell was uttered or a single drop of sacred oil was applied, the body underwent a transformation so fundamental that it was the absolute prerequisite for eternity. This was the 40-day immersion in natron, a naturally occurring salt harvested from the dry lake beds of Egypt. On the surface, this seems like a straightforward, if lengthy, drying process. We are taught that the salts drew out the moisture, desiccating the tissues and preventing rot. And while that is true, this conventional explanation barely scratches the surface of what was actually being achieved. If our hypothesis about a microscopic preservation technology holds any water, then the natron treatment was far more than simple drying. It was the masterstroke of environmental engineering, a deliberate and calculated act to create the perfect sterile workspace for the nanoscale workforce to operate. Think of it like a surgeon preparing an operating room. Before a single incision is made, the room is scrubbed down, the air is filtered, and the instruments are sterilized. This isn't just a matter of cleanliness. It is a non-negotiable requirement to eliminate any competing biological agents, bacteria, fungi, viruses, that could contaminate the procedure and cause it to fail. The natron salt was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of this rigorous sterilization protocol. By covering the body in this potent desiccant for 40 days, the embalmers weren't just removing water, they were systematically annihilating the entire ecosystem of decay. Bacteria, the primary decomposers, require a moist, nutrient-rich environment to thrive. The hypersaline, drying conditions created by the natron salt would have caused these microorganisms to shrivel and die through a process called osmosis, effectively creating a sterile field. This wasn't a side effect, it was the entire point. The body was being purged of the very forces of chaos, the isfet, that the entire mummification process was designed to defeat. This creation of a sterile environment is arguably the most sophisticated part of the entire process. For any advanced preservation technology to work, especially one operating at a microscopic level, it needs an uncontaminated workspace. Imagine trying to deploy a team of nanobots programmed to reinforce cellular structures. only to have them constantly fighting off a rampant bacterial infection. Their energy would be wasted, their programming could be disrupted, and the entire system would be at risk of catastrophic failure. The natron salt treatment neutralized this threat entirely. It gave the hypothesized internal agents a clean slate, a stable, inert platform from which to begin their meticulous work. The 40-day period is also significant. It wasn't an arbitrary number. It was likely the precise amount of time needed to ensure complete desiccation and sterility throughout the entire body, from the surface of the skin down to the deepest tissues. This thoroughness underscores the scientific precision behind what we often dismiss as a primitive ritual. Furthermore, the stability offered by the natron-treated body cannot be overstated. Once desiccated, the tissues entered a state of suspended animation. Chemical reactions that cause decay grind to a halt without water. This stable, static state is the ideal condition for long-term preservation. It's the difference between trying to repair a machine while it's still running versus when it's safely powered down. The natron treatment effectively powered down the biological processes of decay, creating a stable structure that the sacred oils and unguents could then permeate and transform. The salts themselves may have even begun to alter the chemical composition of the tissues, breaking down fats into simpler compounds and saponifying them, which could have created a more receptive base for the preservative agents that followed. In this light, the natron bath emerges not as the simple beginning of the process, but as its most critical enabling step. It was the necessary foundation upon which the entire technological miracle of mummification was built, ensuring that the microscopic protectors and rebuilders, once activated, could perform their eternal duties in a perfectly controlled and hostile-free environment. After creating a sterile environment and potentially deploying a microscopic workforce, the entire system required a stable and secure housing. This brings us to one of the most iconic elements of the mummy, the intricate, layered cocoon of linen bandages. We typically view this wrapping as a final, respectful act, a way to protect the delicate, desiccated body from physical damage. But what if its function was far more advanced? What if these bandages were not just a protective shroud, but an integral, active component of the preservation technology, a sophisticated containment and delivery system that worked in concert with the spells inscribed upon them? Consider first the sheer physical precision of the wrapping. It wasn't a haphazard bundling. It was a meticulous, multi-layered process that could use hundreds of square feet of fabric applied in specific patterns and sequences. This careful construction suggests a purpose beyond mere containment. In modern engineering, we use layered composites to achieve specific results. Think of the heat shield tiles on a space shuttle, each layer designed to manage thermal energy in a different way. The linen wrappings could be seen as a similar composite system. The multiple layers would create a stable microenvironment around the body, buffering it against sudden changes in temperature or humidity that could threaten its integrity over centuries. This wrappings would act as a physical barrier, yes, but also as a regulatory system, maintaining the stable, dry conditions that the natron treatment had so carefully established. They were the final seal on the sterile workspace, but the linen itself may have been more than just a passive fabric. High-quality linen made from flax has remarkable properties. It is strong, durable, and can act as a natural antibacterial and hypoallergenic material. It's possible that the linen was impregnated with the very same sacred oils and unguents we discussed earlier. If those unguents were a carrier medium for active agents, then the bandages become a slow-release mechanism. As they were wound around the body, they would be in constant contact with the skin, allowing the preservative compounds to transfer gradually and continuously to the mummy's surface, from where they could continue to diffuse inward over time. This turns the wrappings from a static shell into a dynamic delivery system, providing a long-term supply of the materials needed for ongoing maintenance, much like a transdermal patch used in modern medicine. This idea of the bandages as an active system is powerfully amplified when we consider the spells. It was common practice, especially for royalty and the elite, to have chapters from the Book of the Dead or other protective incantations written directly onto the linen strips before they were applied. We have always interpreted this as a way to magically surround the body with protective words, but let's apply our technological lens. If a spell is a set of instructions, a line of code written in the language of Heka, then inscribing it onto the bandage is like writing a program directly onto the hardware. The bandage is no longer just a piece of cloth, it becomes a readable medium. Imagine these inscribed linens as a kind of ancient firmware. The hypothesized nanoscale agents inside the body, once activated by the opening of the mouth ceremony, might need ongoing instructions or periodic updates to their programming to adapt to changing conditions over millennia. The spells woven into their very physical environment could serve as that constant reference guide. A bandage over the chest inscribed with a spell to protect the heart might be broadcasting a continuous command to the internal agents in that region. Priority 1. Maintain structural integrity of cardiac tissue. A strip over the abdomen with a spell against poison could be programming the defensive units in that area to remain on high alert for specific biological threats. The bandages, in this sense, become a distributed network of information with different lines of code positioned strategically across the body to manage different subsystems. This transforms the act of wrapping from a ritual into a highly precise installation process. Each turn of the linen strip was like connecting a new circuit or uploading a new software module to the system. The priests weren't just wrapping a body, they were installing a complex operating system, layer by meticulous layer. The final result was a fully integrated biopreservation unit, a sterile, stable core body inhabited by a microscopic workforce, all contained within and managed by a smart fabric shroud that provided both physical stability and continuous programming. The mummy, therefore, was not a passive object waiting for spiritual resurrection. It was an active, self-sustaining system engineered for eternity, with its instructions literally woven into the very fabric of its being. Woven directly into the linen wrappings, placed with deliberate care upon specific parts of the body, were the amulets. These small, powerful charms crafted from semi-precious stones, faience, or gold, are usually explained as magical tokens, each granting a specific form of divine protection to the deceased. But if we view the mummy as an integrated technological system, these amulets transform into something far more precise. They begin to resemble pre-programmed cartridges or specialized command modules, each one designed to be installed at a critical anatomical location to administer a very specific function to the microscopic workforce within. The placement wasn't random, it was a targeted deployment of specialized software to specific hardware components. Take, for instance, the Jed Pillar amulet, one of the most important and frequently used. This symbol, resembling a stylized backbone, was almost always placed on the neck or the throat of the mummy. Its traditional meaning is stability, endurance, and the backbone of the god Osiris himself. In a spiritual sense, it was meant to ensure the deceased would stand firm and resolute in the afterlife, but through our technological lens, this placement is remarkably specific. The spine is the central support structure of the entire body, the literal backbone. By positioning the Jed pillar over this critical area, the priests were not just making a vague wish for strength. They were, in effect, installing a stability module. This amulet could be seen as a command cartridge programmed to direct nanoscale agents in the surrounding tissues to reinforce the spinal column at a molecular level, cross-linking the proteins in the vertebrae and the surrounding musculature to create an unshakable core, ensuring the eternal body would never slump or collapse into decay. Then we have the Ankh, the iconic symbol of life. It was commonly placed over the chest or the abdomen. While its general purpose was to grant the breath of life in the afterlife, its specific placement suggests a more targeted role. Positioned over the torso, which houses the heart, lungs, and digestive organs, the Ankh amulet could be interpreted as a vitality or energy module. Its function might have been to program the internal agents to maintain a state of simulated metabolic activity, not in the sense of actual digestion or breathing, but in the preservation of the tissue's vital essence. It could have been the command that instructed the microscopic workforce to continuously repair and rejuvenate the cellular matrix, counteracting the faint but persistent forces of entropy to keep the body in a perpetual state of animated readiness, forever holding the potential for life. Perhaps the most telling example is the heart scarab, which we touched on earlier. This was not placed randomly. It was set directly over the heart, often with a specific spell from the Book of the Dead inscribed on its underside, begging the heart not to bear witness against its owner. This goes beyond simple programming. It's a direct interface with the core processing unit of the deceased. The heart was believed to hold the individual's memory, identity, and consciousness. The heart scarab, then, can be seen as the ultimate data integrity module. Its purpose was not just to protect the physical organ, but to safeguard the data it contained. It might have been programmed to command specialized nanites to create a stable, error-correcting matrix around the heart tissue, ensuring the molecular structures that encoded the person's very essence would remain uncorrupted for all eternity, perfectly balanced and ready for the weighing ceremony. The variety of other amulets reinforces this concept of a modular system. A pair of Isis knots placed on the body could symbolize the programming of agents to bind or secure the limbs, ensuring structural integrity. An amulet of the god hair, representing millions of years, might be a command for long-term system durability. Each charm was like a different piece of software on a key drive, and the act of placing it on the body was the moment that software was uploaded to that specific location. The materials themselves, lapis lazuli for divinity, carnelian for power, green feldspar for vitality, may have been chosen not just for their color symbolism, but for their intrinsic physical or even subtle energetic properties that could interact with or enhance the function of the preservation process. This system of amulets reveals an astonishingly sophisticated approach, treating the body not as a monolithic entity, but as a collection of interconnected systems, each requiring its own customized set of instructions to ensure the whole functioned flawlessly forever. All of these intricate measures, the amulets acting as specialized command modules, the bandages forming a smart containment system, were focused on one ultimate objective: creating a perfect eternal vessel. But a vessel, no matter how perfectly engineered, is meaningless without that which it is designed to hold. This brings us to the very heart of ancient Egyptian spirituality, and a concept that perfectly completes our technological analogy: the profound duality of the Ba and the Ka. To truly appreciate the purpose behind the monumental effort of mummification, we must understand that the Egyptians saw a human being as a composite of multiple elements. The physical body, which they called the Khot, was just one part. Two other components were absolutely essential for a conscious afterlife: the Ba and the Ka. And when we look at these concepts through our modern lens, they form a stunningly precise analogy for the relationship between hardware and software. Let's start with the Ka. Think of the Ka as the vital spark, the essential life force that distinguished a living person from a corpse. It was your spiritual double, a kind of invisible twin that was born with you and maintained your individuality. The Ka was not a ghost that wandered off after death. It needed a physical anchor to survive. It required sustenance, food, drink, and a place to reside. This is why tombs were equipped with offering tables, and why the Egyptians placed such immense importance on the preservation of the body. The mummified corpse, the Khot, was the permanent home for the Ka. In our technological analogy, if the nanotech-preserved body is the exquisitely crafted hardware, the supercomputer, the server, the physical machine, then the Ka is its power source. It is the electricity that flows into the system, the energy that brings the hardware to life and allows it to function. Without a stable, intact body to serve as its conduit and vessel, the car would dissipate and the individual would cease to exist. The entire mummification process, therefore, was an act of building an eternal power station, a housing designed to keep the car energized and connected forever. Now let's consider the ba. This is often loosely translated as the soul or personality, but that doesn't quite capture its unique nature. The ba was the part of a person that was mobile and could travel. It was depicted as a human-headed bird, symbolizing its ability to fly between the tomb and the outer world. The ba contained your memory, your character, your consciousness, everything that made you you. After death, the ba would journey through the underworld, but crucially, it had to return to the tomb each night to reunite with the ka and the body. This nightly reunion was what sustained the individual's existence in the afterlife. So, if the ka is the power source and the body is the hardware, then the ba is undoubtedly the software. It is the operating system, the programs, the data, and the user interface all rolled into one. It contains all the information, the accumulated experiences, and the essential code of your identity. This creates a complete and elegant system. The preserved body, the hardware, provides a stable physical platform. The ka, the power source, supplies the necessary energy to run the system. And the ba, the software, is the conscious identity that operates within that system. Each is utterly dependent on the others. Corrupt the software and the identity is lost. Lose power and the system shuts down forever. But most critically for our exploration, if the hardware degrades, if the body decays, then the entire system collapses. The power source has nowhere to go and the software has no machine on which to run. This is precisely where our hypothesized nanotechnology fits in. The microscopic workforce we've been discussing had one overarching critical mission: to maintain the integrity of the hardware against the relentless forces of time and decay. Their job was to ensure the physical body remained a viable, stable host for millennia, so that the ka could always power the system and the ba could always return home. This analogy transforms the spiritual goal of mummification into a breathtakingly practical engineering problem. The priests weren't just praying for a spiritual outcome, they were architecting a system for eternal consciousness. The spells and rituals were the code that programmed the nanoscale agents. Their primary directive was unambiguous: prevent hardware failure. This meant reinforcing tissues, fighting corruption, and creating an environment so stable that the sacred union of the ba and ka could continue uninterrupted for eternity. The fear of the second death, of being forgotten and having your tomb destroyed, wasn't just a fear of anonymity. It was the terror of a system crash. A destroyed tomb meant a destroyed body, which meant a severed connection for the ka and a ba with nowhere to return, resulting in the permanent deletion of a soul. The entire Egyptian obsession with eternity, therefore, can be seen as the ultimate project in data integrity and system maintenance, a technological and spiritual endeavor to build a forever home for the essence of a human being. So we've explored this fascinating possibility that the ancient Egyptian mummification process could be interpreted as an allegory for a sophisticated nanoscale preservation technology. But this idea moves from the realm of pure speculation into something far more compelling when we look at what modern scientists are actually doing today. The parallels are not just philosophical, they are functional, revealing that the core concept the Egyptians might have been describing is precisely the direction in which 21st century science is now heading. Consider the cutting-edge field of art and artifact conservation. Our most precious cultural heritage, ancient manuscripts, fragile textiles, and deteriorating paintings, faces a constant battle against time. Traditional preservation methods often involve applying broad-spectrum coatings or consolidants, which can be invasive, can alter the appearance of the artifact, and may not penetrate deeply enough to address decay at its source. But now, researchers are turning to nanotechnology for a more elegant solution. they are developing nanoparticles engineered for incredibly specific tasks. For instance, calcium hydroxide nanoparticles, tiny enough to seep into the microscopic pores of ancient marble or limestone, can carbonize and recrystallize, effectively rebinding weathered stone from the inside out, strengthening it without creating a visible surface crust. This is a perfect example of targeted, molecular-level intervention, mirroring the idea of divine workers reinforcing the body from within. The parallels extend to organic materials as well. Scientists are experimenting with nanocapsules designed to deliver consolidants and protective agents directly to the decaying fibers of historical documents or wooden artifacts. These capsules can be programmed to release their contents slowly over time or in response to specific environmental triggers, like a rise in humidity. This isn't a passive coating, it's an active, responsive preservation system. Doesn't that sound remarkably similar to our interpretation of the Uraeus as an autonomous defense system, or the Shabtis as a perpetual maintenance crew? The modern goal is the same as the ancient one, to create a stable state that can withstand the centuries, using agents that work on a scale invisible to the naked eye. Perhaps the most direct parallel lies in the emerging science of biopreservation. Today, laboratories are seriously investigating the use of nanotechnologies for stabilizing biological samples, even entire organisms, for long-term storage. Research is exploring how engineered nanoparticles can be used to cross-link proteins, inhibit enzymatic degradation, and create synthetic matrices that hold cellular structures in perfect stasis. The objective is to halt decay so completely that the sample remains viable for hundreds, even thousands of years. This is not science fiction. It is the explicit goal of certain branches of cryonics and long-term biobanking. When an ancient Egyptian text speaks of making the flesh incorruptible and the limbs like iron, it is expressing the same ultimate ambition that drives these modern labs. They are both seeking a technological answer to the problem of entropy. This convergence of ancient concept and modern practice does not, of course, prove that the Egyptians possessed nanobots. What it does is something perhaps more important. It validates the logical structure of their alleged approach. It demonstrates that thinking about preservation in terms of targeted, microscopic, and autonomous agents is not an anachronistic fantasy but a legitimate and powerful scientific paradigm. The ancient priests, observing the successful results of their elaborate 70-day process, would have needed a framework to explain how it worked. They used the language of divine multitudes and cosmic principles. We use the language of nanoparticles and programmable code, but both descriptions point toward a sophisticated understanding of achieving permanence through minute, intelligent action. The fact that our most advanced preservation science is now converging on a model that so closely resembles the allegorical one found in the pyramid texts and the Book of the Dead suggests that the ancient Egyptians may have intuitively grasped a profound technological truth, one we are only now beginning to engineer. Of course, this fascinating interpretation we've been exploring exists squarely outside the boundaries of conventional Egyptology, and to present a complete picture, we must now turn to the compelling and necessary perspectives of scholarly skepticism. The mainstream view, held by the vast majority of Egyptologists, archaeologists, and historians, sees the funerary texts in a very different light, not as encrypted technical manuals, but as profound expressions of religious belief and symbolic thought. From this vantage point, the idea of nanobots is a classic case of what scholars call anachronism, the era of imposing our modern concepts, technologies, and ways of thinking onto an ancient culture that operated with a completely different framework for understanding the world. For these experts, the pyramid texts and the Book of the Dead are masterpieces of spirituality, and to read them as descriptions of technology is to miss their true, deeper meaning. The core of the mainstream argument rests on understanding the ancient Egyptian worldview on its own terms. Theirs was not a society that separated science, religion, and magic into distinct categories as we do today. For them, the universe was an interconnected whole governed by divine principles. The gods were not distant beings but active, immanent forces in nature. When a spell speaks of the followers of Osiris reassembling the body, an Egyptologist would argue it is a powerful metaphor for spiritual rebirth and the soul's integration with the divine order, not a literal description of a microscopic workforce. The symbolism is the point. The heart is weighed against the feather of man, not to run a system diagnostic, but to convey a universal moral truth, that a life lived in harmony with cosmic order is the only path to salvation. To reduce these rich, multi-layered allegories to a one-to-one technological correspondence is, in the eyes of many scholars, to diminish their cultural and philosophical significance. Furthermore, there is a significant evidentiary gap. Mainstream science relies on physical proof. To date, there is no archaeological evidence, no unusual residues on mummies, no inscriptions describing engineering principles, no artifacts that suggest a knowledge of microbiology or particle physics. The entire nanobot theory is an interpretation built on reading between the lines of texts that are explicitly and consistently religious in nature. Egyptologists would point out that we have extensive records detailing the practical, mundane aspects of mummification. The names of tools, the prices of linen, the recipes for simpler embalming oils, but nowhere is there a mention of creating or deploying microscopic machines. The success of mummification is attributed by historians to a combination of skilled practice, the exceptionally dry climate of Egypt, and the effective, if empirically discovered, antibacterial properties of materials like natron and resin. This is not to say that the ancient Egyptians weren't brilliant innovators. They absolutely were. Their achievements in architecture, medicine, and astronomy are undeniable. But their brilliance was expressed within the context of their time and their culture. The danger of anachronism is that it can lead us to overlook the genuine marvel of how they actually thought. It is arguably more astonishing that a civilization without our technology conceived of such complex processes of transformation and eternity, using only the language of myth and symbol. The mystery is not lessened by acknowledging that these were spiritual concepts. It is deepened. It forces us to grapple with the power of the human imagination to articulate profound truths about life, death, and renewal in a way that continues to captivate us thousands of years later. So, while the nanobot theory offers a thrilling and thought-provoking lens, it remains a speculative interpretation, a what-if scenario that highlights the enduring enigmatic power of ancient Egypt rather than a settled historical fact. This tension between imaginative reinterpretation and rigorous scholarship is precisely what keeps the conversation about these incredible texts so alive and endlessly fascinating. This brings us to perhaps the most profound and alluring concept in all of Egyptian mythology, Zep-Tepi, the first time. This was not merely a historical period for the ancient Egyptians. It was their foundational golden age, a primordial epoch when the world was perfectly ordered and the gods themselves walked the earth, ruling directly over the Nile Valley. It was a time of pure creation when the principles of Maat were established and the blueprint for civilization was laid down by divine hands. The memory of Zep-Tepi was the source of their cultural identity, the benchmark against which all later human achievement was measured. And it is within this myth of a lost, godlike era that our technological hypothesis finds its most compelling historical context. What if the incredible preservation techniques we've been exploring were not originally developed by human priests, but were instead a remnant of that first advanced age? The theory suggests that the mummification process, with its staggering complexity and inexplicable success, might be a surviving fragment of a science so sophisticated it appeared, to later generations, indistinguishable from magic. Imagine a scenario where the original knowledge behind this technology was indeed bestowed during Zep-Tepi. The gods in this reinterpretation could be seen not as mythological beings, but as a highly advanced civilization, perhaps even an earlier, lost human culture possessing a mastery over matter and biology that we are only now beginning to glimpse. They would have understood genetics, molecular engineering, and principles of atomic scale manipulation. In such a context, creating a process for eternal preservation would be a feasible, if complex, application of their science. This advanced knowledge was then taught to the earliest Egyptian rulers and wise men, who implemented it with precision. The result was a funerary practice of unparalleled effectiveness, a technological marvel that ensured the physical vessel of a leader would endure for eternity. But civilizations fall and cataclysms occur. The knowledge of Zep-Tepi, as the myths imply, did not last forever. Over millennia, as dynasties rose and fell, as languages evolved and libraries were lost, the deep scientific understanding behind the preservation process began to fade. The why and the how, the principles of nanotechnology, if you will, slowly slipped from memory. What remained were the rituals themselves, the specific words to be chanted, the exact measurements of natron, the precise sequence of anointing, the correct placement of amulets. The underlying science devolved into a set of procedures, a sacred recipe that was passed down through generations of priests. The original technical manual became a book of spells. The act of programming a swarm of nanobots became the ritual of swallowing the eye of Horus. The activation sequence became the opening of the mouth ceremony. The technology was preserved, but the understanding of its mechanics was lost, leaving only the powerful, symbolic shell of the practice intact. This process, known as cargo cult science in a modern context, is where the ritualized magic we recognize from the Book of the Dead truly emerges. The priests of the New Kingdom, for all their dedication and skill, were likely not the original engineers. They were the guardians of a tradition whose core principles had become opaque. They knew that if they performed the rituals with exactitude, if they used the correct unguents, recited the spells with the proper intonation, and arranged the amulets in the designated pattern, the miracle would occur. The body would not decay. They were following a protocol they didn't fully comprehend, but whose efficacy they trusted completely because it was a legacy from the age of the gods themselves. The language of divinity and magic became the only vocabulary sufficient to describe a process whose technological roots were now buried in the sands of time. The myth of Zep-Tepi, therefore, serves as a powerful explanation for the disconnect between the almost supernatural success of mummification and the seemingly pre-scientific toolkit of its practitioners. It suggests that what we are witnessing in the tombs of the pharaohs is not the birth of a primitive superstition, but the graceful, ritualized decline of a once advanced technology. And so we arrive at the ultimate test case for this extraordinary theory, a moment frozen in time that has captivated the world for over a century, the tomb of the boy king Tutankhamun. When Howard Carter first peered into the burial chamber in 1922, he witnessed a scene of unparalleled archaeological wealth, but for our exploration, the true marvel was not the gold but the king himself. While many royal mummies from grander tombs were reduced to skeletons or badly decayed by looters and environmental damage, Tutankhamun's body was found in a state of preservation that stunned experts. The conventional explanation points to the fact that his small, hastily prepared tomb was buried by debris from the construction of a later pharaoh's tomb, sealing it off from the elements and from human interference for more than 3,000 years. The stable, dry environment undoubtedly played a crucial role. But what if there was another factor at work? What if the specific combination of spells, amulets, and rituals chosen for his burial, perhaps because of its rushed nature, represented an exceptionally pure or potent version of the preservation protocol? Tutankhamun was buried during a turbulent period, as Egypt sought to restore traditional practices after the radical religious revolution of Akhenaten. His funerary equipment, while lavish, was in many cases adapted from others or assembled quickly. this haste might have ironically led to a fascinating outcome. Instead of a sprawling, overly complex set of rituals that could have introduced procedural errors over a lengthy 70-day process, Tutankhamun's priests may have adhered to a core, essential set of instructions, a streamlined program that was executed with precision. The famous golden death mask, an icon of ancient Egypt, is more than a beautiful artifact in this context. It is a masterpiece of targeted amulet placement. The mask itself is inlaid with lapis lazuli and quartz, materials believed to hold potent properties, and it features the Uraeus cobra and vulture on its brow, symbolizing the activation of the highest-level defensive systems. This wasn't just a portrait, it was the primary interface module installed directly onto the king's head. More compelling evidence lies within the wrappings. Tutankhamun's mummy was found to be drenched in an incredible volume of sacred unguents, far more than was typical. This black, resinous paste was poured over the body within the innermost coffin, so thickly that it actually carbonized and cemented the king to the bottom of his solid gold casket. From a traditional view, this was a ritual mistake, a botched job that damaged the remains. But through our technological lens, this could be reinterpreted as an extreme, perhaps even desperate, application of the divine fluid, the carrier medium for the hypothesized preservation agents. The priests, knowing the tomb was not ideal or that the king died unexpectedly, may have intentionally saturated the body to ensure the microscopic workforce had an overwhelming abundance of resources with which to perform their eternal duties. The resulting chemical reaction, while destructive to the archaeological context, may have created an exceptionally stable, sealed microenvironment around the body itself, a last-ditch effort to guarantee success. The specific amulets found on Tutankhamun are also telling. He was equipped with a vast array of charms, but notably, he possessed not one but two daggers, one with a blade of gold and another, astonishingly, with a blade forged from meteoric iron. In the Bronze Age, iron from a meteorite was considered a divine metal, a literal piece of the heavens. Placed within his wrappings, this iron dagger could be seen as the ultimate hardening module, a command to make the king's substance as enduring and incorruptible as the stars themselves. Furthermore, the presence of 143 objects carefully arranged on his body, from protective deities to symbols of power, suggests a meticulous installation of a complete software suite. Each item was a line of code, a specific instruction for the preservation system. The famous failure of the curse, the lack of supernatural retribution against the excavators, could be seen not as a refutation of the tomb's power, but as a testament to its perfect internal focus. The technological safeguards were designed to protect the king's vessel from internal decay, not from external intruders millennia later. Ultimately, the pristine state of Tutankhamun's mummy, even with the damage caused by the initial excavation, stands as a powerful piece of anecdotal evidence. It suggests that the effectiveness of the preservation process may not have depended solely on the grandeur of the tomb, but on the precise and potent application of the core ritual technology. In a tomb that was otherwise modest, the survival of the body itself is the most profound treasure. It implies that the priests of the late 18th dynasty, perhaps drawing on a purer, less corrupted tradition, knew exactly which commands were essential. They focused their efforts not on building an impregnable fortress, but on perfecting the internal environment of the vessel. Tutankhamun's enduring legacy, therefore, may be that he became the unwitting beneficiary of a perfectly executed ancient program, a protocol so effective that it allowed his physical form to defy time itself, offering us a silent, powerful testament to a lost science whose principles we are only now beginning to imagine. All this speculation leads to a truly fascinating question. If this wasn't just symbolic magic, if there was a genuine technological process at work, then how could it have been physically possible? Let's engage in a balanced what-if scenario, exploring the practicalities that such a theory would need to address. the first and perhaps most daunting challenge is the question of a power source. A microscopic workforce, even one operating at the atomic level, would require energy to perform its tasks of repair, defense, and maintenance over thousands of years. In our modern world, we power our tiny electronics with batteries or by harvesting energy from light or motion, but these solutions have limited lifespans. The ancient system, however, was designed for eternity, so what could have provided a perpetual, sustainable energy source within the dark, sealed environment of a tomb? One compelling possibility lies in the materials the Egyptians themselves used. The natron salts that desiccated the body are crystalline structures, and certain crystals can exhibit a property known as piezoelectricity, where they generate a small electrical charge in response to mechanical stress. The subtle shifts in the Earth over centuries, the minute tectonic pressures, or even the constant, stable temperature of the deep tomb could have provided just enough ambient energy to be harvested by a sophisticated nanoscale system. Alternatively, the energy might have been chemical, drawn from the very preservatives and sacred unguents themselves. If these compounds were designed to break down extremely slowly, they could have acted as a long-term battery, releasing energy in tiny, controlled increments to power the internal workforce. Then we arrive at the even more complex puzzle of manufacturing. How could an ancient civilization possibly create functional machines on a scale invisible to the human eye? The answer might not lie in the machinery we imagine with gears and circuits, but in something far more elegant and inherently natural, organic-based nanotechnology. Instead of building robots from metal and silicon, the priests could have been master biochemists, engineering specialized viruses or bacteria. In our own time, scientists are already using modified viruses to assemble nanowires or deliver genetic material to specific cells. The Egyptians, with their profound knowledge of plant chemistry and natural substances, might have discovered or cultivated microscopic life forms that could be programmed through selective breeding or chemical triggers to perform specific tasks. These wouldn't be artificial robots in our sense, but trained biological agents, a divine workforce indeed, drawn from the very building blocks of life. Their manufacturing process would not be a factory, but a sacred garden or a specially prepared culture medium, grown and refined over generations. This idea of a biological basis connects powerfully to the concept of self-assembly we explored with the scarab beetle. The true genius of the technology might not have been in crafting each tiny worker by hand, but in designing a system where the workers could build themselves. By combining specific organic compounds in the sacred unguents under the precise conditions dictated by the ritual, the recitation of the true names, the timing, the temperature, the priests could have been initiating a chain reaction of molecular self-organization. The components, once mixed and activated by the words of power, would spontaneously arrange themselves into the desired functional structures, just as amino acids fold into proteins or cells divide and differentiate. This process would be invisible, seemingly magical, and would not require any tools finer than the principles of chemistry itself. The divine workers would not be manufactured. They would be grown, emerging fully formed from a primordial soup of sacred ingredients, ready to execute their programmed duties. This brings us to the most speculative and yet most philosophically consistent possibility, that the ancient Egyptians had tapped into a fundamental level of reality we are only beginning to understand. What if their mastery was not of biology or chemistry alone, but of the quantum realm? The principle of Heka, as the underlying creative force of the universe, begins to sound remarkably similar to some modern interpretations of quantum fields and the observer effect, the idea that consciousness can influence the state of matter. If Heka was indeed a real, manipulable force, then the spells and rituals were not mere superstition. They were a precise technology for directing intention at a quantum level. The focused will of the priest, amplified by ritual and spoken through the true names of things, could have been the instrument that guided the quantum state of the materials within the mummy. In this scenario, the nanobots are not physical entities at all, but stable, localized quantum coherence patterns, areas where matter is locked into a specific, imperishable state by conscious command. The power source is the universe itself, and the manufacturing process is an act of focused consciousness manipulating the fabric of reality. This idea, while far beyond our current scientific capabilities, provides a stunning reconciliation of the magical and the technological. It suggests that the Egyptians understood something profound, that at the deepest level, matter and mind are not separate, and that the ultimate technology for shaping the physical world lies in the disciplined application of will through the sacred language of Heka. Whether through crystalline energy, organic machines, or quantum manipulation, the theory pushes us to reconsider the limits of ancient knowledge and the true nature of the power they believed they were wielding. This journey through the symbolism of ancient Egypt reveals a narrative that did not end with the closing of the last pharaoh's tomb. Instead, it embarked on a different kind of voyage, sailing through the centuries to resurface in a world the priests could never have imagined, the realm of modern science fiction. The haunting desire to cheat death to preserve the self intact for a future awakening is a thread that connects the embalmers of the Nile directly to the writers and dreamers of the 20th and 21st centuries. We can see a clear lineage, an unconscious borrowing of themes, where the sacred practices of mummification were stripped of their religious context and reclothed in the language of technology, creating a powerful feedback loop between our deepest past and our most ambitious futures. Consider the concept of cryogenics and suspended animation, a staple of stories from Buck Rogers to Alien and Planet of the Apes. A character is sealed within a chamber, their biological processes slowed or halted entirely to be reanimated centuries later in a new world. The parallels to the mummification process are striking. The cryotube is the modern sarcophagus, a high-tech coffin designed to shield the body from the decay of time. The freezing process is our version of the natron salts, a method of achieving a state of perfect stasis by removing the corrupting influence of liquid water and biological activity. The promise is identical, that the individual preserved in this pristine condition will one day be awakened, their identity and consciousness restored. This is not merely a similar idea. It is the same ancient hope translated from the ritualistic chants of Anubis's priests into the hum of machinery and the glow of diagnostic screens. The mummy in its tomb, waiting for the afterlife, is the direct ancestor of the astronaut in cryosleep, waiting to reach the stars, but the most profound resonance lies in the depiction of nanotechnology itself within science fiction. For decades, authors have envisioned microscopic machines capable of miraculous feats of healing and reconstruction. In Greg Bear's novel Blood Music, nanites redesign human biology from within, creating new, perfected forms. In the world of Neil Stephenson's The Diamond Age, they assemble matter on demand, building anything from air and raw materials. And perhaps most famously, the Borg from Star Trek used nanite-based assimilation to transform individuals into cyborgs, repairing damage and enhancing capabilities in real time. Listen to the description of these processes, the idea of countless, unseen agents working in concert to rebuild and improve a biological structure, and the echo of the coffin texts is unmistakable. The science fiction nanites are the literal, technological incarnation of the divine workers and the followers of Osiris. They are the ancient concept, stripped of its spiritual symbolism and realized through engineering. The feedback loop is complete. An idea born from an ancient intuition about preservation has fueled our modern imagination, which in turn is now actively striving to bring that same idea into physical reality. This cycle reveals something profound about the human psyche. The tools and the explanations change, but the core narratives that give our lives meaning remain remarkably constant. The ancient Egyptian, facing the mystery of death, constructed a detailed, systematic process involving purification, protection, and the hope of reanimation. The modern human, facing the same existential frontier, constructs stories about frozen astronauts and medical nanobots. Both are acts of profound imagination and hope, using the most advanced conceptual tools available to their respective cultures. The scientist in a lab growing organs with stem cell technology and the priest chanting over a mummy are, in a deep sense, engaged in the same project, asserting human agency against the inevitable tide of entropy. They are both using ritualized knowledge, one scientific, one religious, to impose order on chaos. Ultimately, the legacy of Egyptian mummification is not confined to museums or history books. It lives on in the stories we tell ourselves about the future. It has provided a foundational blueprint, a set of archetypal steps for conquering death that continue to feel intuitively correct. We still believe that preservation requires a sealed environment, an active defense against decay, and a means of reactivation. The symbols have changed. The golden mask is now a chrome cryopod. The sacred unguent is a cryoprotectant solution. The spell of opening is a computer's reboot sequence, but the underlying narrative architecture is thousands of years old. This enduring power suggests that the ancient Egyptians were not just primitive ritualists. They were pioneering architects of hope, and the elaborate technological fantasies we entertain today are, in many ways, the living descendants of the dreams they first sealed within their timeless tombs. Where does this remarkable journey of reinterpretation leave our understanding of human history itself? If we entertain this idea, even as a purely speculative thought experiment, the implications ripple far beyond the sands of Egypt, challenging the very foundations of our conventional historical narrative. For centuries, we have viewed the timeline of human progress as a relatively straightforward ascent. From primitive hunter-gatherers to the agricultural revolution, through the Bronze and Iron Ages, leading eventually to the scientific and industrial revolutions that define our modern world. This linear model neatly places ancient civilizations in a box labeled early, viewing their achievements through a lens of impressive but ultimately primitive ingenuity. Their magic is seen as superstition, their monuments as brute force accomplishments, and their texts as purely mythological. But what if this box is too small? What if the line between the mystical and the mechanical is not as clear as we suppose? This perspective forces us to confront a provocative possibility: the existence of a forgotten chapter in the human story. We readily accept that vast libraries of ancient knowledge have been lost to fire, war, and the slow decay of time. The burning of the Library of Alexandria serving as the most poignant symbol. But we tend to assume that the type of knowledge lost was philosophical, literary, or historical. We rarely consider that what vanished could have been an entirely different paradigm of science, a sophisticated understanding of natural principles expressed not in equations but in allegory and symbol. The nanobot hypothesis, as applied to Egypt, suggests that a civilization's peak of technological achievement might not look like our own. It might not leave behind circuit boards or engines, but instead, it might be encoded in rituals, architecture, and texts that we have spent centuries misinterpreting as purely religious. This isn't about claiming aliens built the pyramids. It's about acknowledging that human intelligence in different cultural contexts can arrive at profound truths through unexpected pathways. The loss of this knowledge wouldn't be the loss of a few facts, but the collapse of an entire scientific worldview, its surviving fragments later ritualized by descendants who preserved the how without understanding the why. This directly challenges the perceived boundary between magic and technology. In our modern mindset, we see a clear divide. Technology is based on reproducible, understandable physical laws, while magic is based on superstition and belief. Yet, as Arthur C. Clarke famously noted, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. The real question is not whether the Egyptians had nanobots as we conceive of them, but whether their conceptual framework allowed them to achieve similar ends through a system we simply don't recognize as technological. If their technology was a fusion of precise material science and a deep understanding of consciousness and intentionality, a science of Heka, then our failure to categorize it doesn't make it magic. It makes our definitions too narrow. The rituals seen this way were not appeals to capricious gods, but repeatable protocols within a consistent, if unfamiliar, scientific model. The success of mummification, a tangible result that spanned millennia, stands as a testament that something they did worked with extraordinary efficacy. Dismissing it all as lucky accident or simple chemistry may be our own failure of imagination. Ultimately, adopting this viewpoint invites us to see history not as a simple linear climb, but as a complex tapestry with potential cycles of advancement and loss. It encourages a newfound humility. When we examine the mind-boggling precision of the pyramids, the advanced medical knowledge in the Edwin Smith papyrus, or the complex cosmological models embedded in mythologies worldwide, we might be seeing not the stumbling beginnings of science, but the faded echoes of a sophisticated grasp of the universe. This doesn't diminish our modern achievements, but it reframes them. We are not the first to ask profound questions about life, matter, and eternity. We are simply the latest to attempt answers using our own particular language of quantum physics and molecular biology. By being open to the idea that ancient knowledge could be both deeply spiritual and highly technical, we open a door to a richer, more mysterious, and far more fascinating past. It transforms history from a museum of quaint artifacts into a living, unsolved puzzle, suggesting that the seeds of our future scientific revolutions might be hidden in plain sight, waiting within the sacred texts and silent tombs of our ancestors for the day we learn how to read them anew. So we have traveled a fascinating path, re-examining the sacred words of the pyramid texts and the Book of the Dead not as spells, but as potential technical descriptions. We began with the concept of divine fluids and sacred unguents, seeing them not merely as symbolic oils but as a sophisticated carrier medium, a delivery system for a microscopic workforce designed to permeate and saturate the body, rendering it incorruptible. We explored the idea of swallowing deities like the Eye of Horus, interpreting this as a profound metaphor for deploying autonomous internal repair units, each god representing a specialized function, a team of circuit for anti-pathogen defense, a battalion of Montu for structural reinforcement. We considered the Uraeus, the poised cobra, as an allegory for an active, automated security system, constantly monitoring the internal environment and spitting its fire, a targeted antimicrobial or energetic response at any threat of decay. We looked at the Canopic jars not as simple storage, but as symbolic housing for specialized maintenance modules, each son of Horus managing a unique team focused on the liver, lungs, stomach, or intestines with custom-tailored preservation protocols. We saw the scarab beetle, Khepri, as a perfect ancient analogy for molecular self-assembly, where a seemingly chaotic mass transforms into a perfected whole according to a hidden blueprint. We even reinterpreted the Shabti figurines as a programmable, deployable workforce for eternal maintenance, and the weighing of the heart as the ultimate system integrity check, a diagnostic to confirm the vessel and its stored data were perfectly preserved and ready for eternity. Through this lens, every ritual, from the opening of the mouth to the intricate wrapping with inscribed linens, transforms from pure ceremony into a deliberate, step-by-step activation and installation of a complex biopreservation system. It is crucial to state again that this is a speculative interpretation, a thought experiment that stands outside mainstream Egyptology. It is not a claim of historical fact, but an invitation to view these ancient achievements with a sense of wonder and a willingness to ask different kinds of questions. The conventional view, which sees these texts as profound spiritual allegories, is rich and valid. Yet the possibility that a deep technological understanding could be encoded within this spiritual framework is a mystery that refuses to fade. It challenges the linear timeline of human progress and blurs the line we so neatly draw between magic and machinery. So we leave you with this final question to ponder. When the ancient priest chanted words of power over the mummy, was he invoking supernatural forces, or was he reciting the operating code for a technology so advanced, so minute, and so elegantly integrated with the natural world that for thousands of years we have lacked the vocabulary to describe it as anything other than magic? The texts remain, waiting for each generation to bring its own understanding. What do you see when you read them? Share your own theories and reflections in the comments below.